Good morning. Once again, we welcome you all to the second day of the International Conference on Mathematical Advances and Applications 2020. Today, we have two eminent speakers to speak to us, to enlighten us, to add knowledge to us. Dr. K. Srinivas Rao, Professor and Head Department of Mathematics, Sri Chandrasekhara Saraswati Mahaviswavidyalaya, Kanchipuram. And we have Dr. Mini Rani, Associate Professor, Department of Mathematics, NIMC Deemed University, Mumbai, to speak to us. And we have professors and research scholars to extend their expertise and their knowledge and their research work by the way of paper presentations. Today we have near about 20 paper presentations, and paper presentations shall happen in parallel sessions. Dr. Mini Rani would be chairing one session, and we have Dr. Vijay Kumar from Manavarachana International Institute of Research, Deemed University, Faridabad, Professor and Head Department of Mathematics, to chair the other session. Our intention, our motive of organizing these conferences is to impart and inculcate the best academic values that we can. Yesterday we had a wonderful session. In spite there were some technical issues in the beginning, you all have supported as well. And it's not like since we have to do a conference, but you can see from the panel of speakers, we had Senior Most Professor from Madurai Kamaraj University, we had Senior Most Professor from IIT Roorkee, and we had one of the eminent researchers from Malaysia. This motive is to do the best that we all can together take the academics high and more higher. And this morning, with the same spirit and with all your support, we would love to move further. Yesterday we had some technical issues and some disturbance was there, but you all could able to cope up and be with us. And today I hope that will not happen, and till now everything is fine and everything will be in control. And being today after the last presentations, we'll have an formal concluding remarks. Then, as promised, all soft copy certificates will be served hopefully by the evening, and also respectively the proceedings and what all you are entitled for. And to add, we wanted to act as just only as facilitators, as today publication in Scopus journals has become so important. Like, we got associated with few journals, and we shall be sharing in the WhatsApp group, and those interested who would like to take the support can do so after seeing the information, maybe till next Saturday, that is 15th August. You may send your full papers, and if you are sending for full papers for Scopus journals, and those papers will be sent to the respective journals, and upon the acceptance you may have to pay the respective charges of the journal levied by the journal, and we will be only acting as facilitators. And coming to our part, we have 8 international research journals. They are peer reviewed, and we have online presence and also in print, whereas we extend the online publication at free of cost for all those who have participated into this conference. And if you are interested, so you may also send your papers by next Saturday, specifying that you wanted to publish in IMRF peer reviewed journals. We also extend publication in the form of ISBN books, your papers as chapters, and those chapters are counted in every evaluating system. So those interested may also contact our admin team, and we are happy to help you. And there are many academic things that we can share, where you can support, where we can support. Let's all join hands to work together to support each other for collective learning, and to leave and to set an example for our young generations. And I have many things to tell to you, whereas as time permits me, I'll be back again. And now we shall move further for the further proceedings. Thank you very much. We have in our midst Dr. K. Srinivas Rao, Professor and Head Department of Mathematics, Sri Chandrasekhara Saraswati Viswa Mahavidyalaya University, Kanchipuram, Tamil Nadu, India, to speak to us. Dr. K. Srinivas Rao is also a Chairman Statistics and Information Cell at Sri Chandrasekhara Saraswati Viswa Mahavidyalaya University, Kanchipuram. He is Member Board of Studies, Department of Mathematics, Sri Chandrasekhara Saraswati Viswa Mahavidyalaya, and conducted more than 12 research programs and attended more than 36 conferences, workshops, etc. Besides, he delivered more than 23 lectures in India and abroad. He has to his account 71 research publications in international and national journals. He has guided 5 doctoral students, while 4 are ongoing, besides 21 MPhil scholars, and one is still pursuing. Dr. K. Srinivas Rao, sir, is well known in Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu region. A good senior friend of mine. And thank you, sir, for accepting our request and being with us this morning to speak to all of us. We request you to kindly speak to our audience. Thank you, sir.
Welcome to International Conference on Mathematical Advances and Applications. Dear participants, today I would like to give a talk on maximum degree Estrada index. This topic comes under chemical graph theory. So I will spend some time on preliminaries of chemical graph theory. Then I will move to graph invariants, topological indices, and then I will give brief introduction about energy of a graph, Estrada index, maximum degree energy of a graph. Then I move to my topic, that is maximum degree Estrada index. This concept was introduced by me and my scholar K. Saravanan and my collaborator Dr. Ismail Nasik Angul, Uludağ University, Turkey. Nowadays, graph theory has numerous applications in such diverse fields as electronics, sociology, nuclear physics, computer science, ethology, engineering, geography, linguistics, transportation, and particularly in chemistry. Numerous books and review articles have been written on the applications of graph theory. We know a graph G consists of a pair V of G and E of G, where V of G is the set of vertices and E of G is the set of edges. The cardinalities of V of G and E of G are called the order and size of the graph G. The degree of a vertex V is denoted by D of V is the number of edges that a vertex V is incident to in G. The degree the distance between two vertices U and V is denoted by D of UV is the number of edges on the shortest path between U and V in G. For example, if you take this graph, the degree of the vertex A is 3 because the number of edges incident to this vertex are 3. Similarly, the degree of this vertex D is 1. The distance between these two vertices A and D, the distance between these two vertices is denoted by D of A comma D is equal to 2. That is the number of edges on this shortest path from A to D. The shortest from A to D is this A to C and C to D. The number of edges in this path are 2. So the distance between the two vertices, the distance between the two vertices A and D is 2. Next, the molecular graph. In chemical graph theory, the molecular structure of a compound is often represented with a graph where the atoms are represented by vertices and bonds are represented by edges. Here we have to remember two important points. One is we ignore the difference between double bond or whether it is double bond or single bond or triple bond. And second point is we remove vertices corresponding to hydrogen atoms. For example, if you take this naphthalene graph, the corresponding molecular graph is this one. This vertex corresponding to this carbon atom. This vertex is corresponding to this carbon atom. This edge corresponding to this double bond. This edge is corresponding to this single bond. And second point is whether it is the first point is whether it is a single bond or double bond. We take a single edge. Next thing is we remove vertices corresponding to hydrogen atoms. That means molecular graph is nothing but carbon skeleton of the molecule. For example, if you take a biphenyl, the corresponding molecular graph is this one. Suppose if you take 2246 tetramethyleptane, the corresponding molecular graph is this one. So this vertex is corresponding to this carbon. 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 This is the way of writing molecular graph from a given molecule. Next, topological indices. A large portion of chemical graph theory is concerned numerical quantities associated with a molecular graph. An important aim of chemical graph theory is to come up with a useful graph invariants which have a predictive power of physiochemical properties of the molecule if computed from the molecular graph. That means, for example, if you are in a position to define a constant, or if you are in a position to find out a constant from this graph, which have a predictive power of physiochemical properties of this molecule, then those constants are called topological indices. Once again, I'm telling, if you are in a position to define, or if you are in a position to find a constants from this graph, which have a predictive power of physiochemical properties of this graph, then such constants are called topological indices. The topological indices are classified into three categories. Degree-based topological indices. If a topological index is a function of degree of a vertex, then the topological indices are called degree-based topological indices. If the topological index is a function of distance between two vertices, then the type of indices are called distance-based topological indices. Next, my topic comes under third category. If the topological index is a function of eigenvalues, then the type of eigenvalues are called distant spectrum-based topological indices. Spectrum-based topological indices. Now I will give brief introduction about degree-based topological indices and distance-based topological indices. Then I will move to my topic, that is maximum degree Strotter index. So one of the distance-based topological indices is Wiener index. For a given graph G, the Wiener index G is defined as summation u comma v belongs to v of g, d of uv, where d of uv is the shortest distance between the vertices u and v in G. For example, if G has 8 vertices, so we can take 8C2 pairs of vertices from the graph. 8C2 pairs of vertices. 8C2 means 8 into 7 by 2. That means 28 pair of vertices will come. You calculate shortest distance for each pair and add all the values. That value is called Wiener index of the graph. In 1947 and 48, Wiener published a whole series of papers showing that there are excellent correlation between Wiener index and variety of physiochemical properties of organic compounds. In the first paper, he proved that he derived a formula for boiling point in terms of Wiener index. The boiling point of the organic compound is equal to alpha times of Wiener index plus beta times of polarity of number and plus gamma. Like that, he found different physiochemical properties of organic compounds based on a Wiener index. So next, like that, there are so many distance-based topological indices are there. Harari index, terminal Wiener index, hyper Wiener index, Balaban index, Gutmann index, Sneeze index, second geometric arithmetic index, edge Sneeze index, PA index, third arithmetic geometric index, Kirchhoff index, etc. Next category, degree-based topological indices. A large number of degree-based topological indices have been conceived. One among them is Randick index. This Randick index was introduced by Randick in 1975. The Randick index is defined as a summation of 1 by du dv, where u comma v is an edge in the graph G. Next, Zagreb index. First Zagreb index, second Zagreb index. There are atom bond connectivity index, augmented Zagreb index, harmonic index, symmetric division degree index, geometric arithmetic index, sum connectivity index, like that. Next, now with this brief introduction, I am going to my topic, that is first topic is energy of a graph. He is Ivan Gutman, Serbian chemist and mathematician. He is one of the pioneers of chemical graph theory. He introduced uh, the energy of a graph in 1978. Before going to the definition of energy of a graph, we need some preliminaries, that is basic definitions. The adjacency matrix of a graph. The adjacency matrix of a graph G is defined as the adjacency matrix of A, the adjacency matrix A of G is uh, ith row jth column element of A is 1 if Vi is adjacent to Vj, otherwise it is 0. For example, if you take this graph, this graph has 6 vertices, so we'll get 6 by 6 square matrix. The first row of this 6 by 6 matrix is 0, 1, 0, 0, 1. So here, first row, second column element is 1. First row, sixth column element is 1. So here V1 is, there is a edge between V1 to V6. So we have an element at first row, second column element. There is an edge from V1 to V6. So we have an element 1 at 1 comma first row, sixth column element. There is no direct edge from V1 to V3, V1 to V4 and V1 to V5. So we have 0 at second row, first row, third column elements, first row, fourth column element, first row, fifth column element. There is no self loop here, so we have 0 here. See, like that. This matrix is called adjacency matrix of this graph. We can easily observe that the adjacency matrix is always real symmetric. There is a well-known property in linear algebra. The eigenvalues of real symmetric matrix are always real. If you calculate the eigenvalues of this matrix, you will get real values. The sum of absolute values of eigenvalues of adjacency matrix of a graph is called energy of the graph. The eigenvalues of this matrix are plus or minus 2, plus or minus 1, plus or minus 1. The sum of absolute values of eigenvalues of adjacency matrix of this graph is 2 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is equal to 8. This value 8 is called the energy of this graph. That is the definition of energy of a graph. The energy of a graph G, the energy of a graph E, was first defined by Ivan Gutman in 1978 as the sum of the absolute values of the eigenvalues of the adjacency matrix of the graph. The first question is, why should we study this energy of a graph? Why should we study the energy of a graph? In the first paper, Ivan Gutman proved that the energy of the graph can be related to the total pi electron energy of a molecule. In the same paper, he established lower and upper bounds of E in terms of n comma m and proved that all the graphs have energy at most 2 into n minus 1. Later, this was disproved in this paper. Ivan Gutman is one of the authors. Then a new concept came, that is hyperenergetic and non-hyperenergetic graphs. A graph is said to be hyperenergetic graph if the energy of the graph is greater than or equal to 2 into n minus 1. If the energy of the graph is less than 2 into n minus 1, then the graph is said to be non-hyperenergetic graph. Families of hyperenergetic and non-hyperenergetic graphs have been constructed in these papers. Next, the great eminent mathematician R. Balakrishnan sir from Bharati Dasam University proved that for any positive integer n is greater than or equal to 3, there exist two equi-energetic graphs of order 4n that are not co-spectral. Next, if the energy of a graph is a rational number, then it must be an even integer and it is never be a square root of an odd integer. never be a square root of an odd integer. Ivan Goodman and Wagner defined another energy, that is matching energy of a graph, and gave some properties and asymptotic results of the matching energy. Later, so many concepts came on energy, distance energy, matching energy, path energy, like that. So Adiga Chandrasekharan is a professor of mathematics, Mysore University. He was recently retired. Introduced minimum covering energy in 2012. 2012. Maruti M. Shakire introduced path matrix and path energy of the graph in 2018. This is a recent paper. He found applications in communication system. He found a communication system. Then Shahid Akbari, this is 2019 paper, established interesting results on path energy. These are the some milestones in energy of a graph from 1978 to 2019. Here, one thing I would like to tell you. Here, I mentioned some important milestones which I know. Next, Estrada index. Estrada index. Let G be a simple undirected graph with n vertices. Let denote lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda n, the eigenvalues of adjacency matrix of G. The graph invariant EEG is defined by EEG is equal to summation I is equal to 1 to n e power lambda y e power lambda I was introduced by Estrada in 2000. It is called Estrada index. Again, why should we study this Estrada index? There are a lot of applications are there in Estrada index. It was used to quantify degree of folding of long organic molecule, especially proteins. It measures the centrality of complex networks, communication, social networks, and metabolic, etc. In this paper, it was established relation between Estrada index and atomic branching. And later, applications are found in statistical thermodynamics, and they established a relation between Estrada index and Shorn entropy. The proposed biochemical, physicochemical, network theoretical, and information theoretical applications of Estrada index are widely accepted and used other members of the scientific community. In addition, mathematicians became interested in Estrada index and communicated mathematical results on Estrada index in mathematical journals. In what follows, we briefly survey the most significant of these results. Numerous lower and upper bounds of Estrada index have been communicated in these papers in terms of vertices and energy, graph energy. Some classes of graphs for the Estrada index have been presented in these papers. This is about brief introduction about this is a brief introduction about Estrada index. Then maximum degree energy. The maximum degree energy was introduced by Adiga Chandrasekharan in 2009. The maximum degree matrix was defined by Adiga Chandrasekharan as follows. Let G be a simple graph with n vertices v1, v2, vn, and let di be the degree of vi, I is equal to 1 to up to so on n. Define dij. Dij is equal to maximum of di dj if vi is adjacent to vj. Otherwise, you take 0. With these elements, if you construct a matrix, that matrix is called maximum degree matrix. For example, if you take this matrix, you will get a 6. This matrix has 6 vertices. Suppose if you take this graph has 6 vertices. So we will get 6 by 6 graph, 6 by 6 square matrix. The first row of this matrix is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 5 because V1 is adjacent to V6. So we will get an element at first row, 6th column element. The first row, 6th column element is the degree of this vertex is 1. The degree of this vertex is 5. So maximum of d of v1 comma d of v6 is 5. So we take 5 is here. Second row. Second row. So here v2, there is no direct edge from v2 to v1. There is v2 is not adjacent to v1, so we get 0 here. v2 is not adjacent to v2. There is no self loop, so we have 0 here. v2 is adjacent to v3. The degree of this vertex is 4. Degree of v2 is 4. Degree of v3 is 2. The maximum of d of v2 and d of v3 is 4. So we have here 4. Similarly, v2 is adjacent to v6. The degree of this vertex is 4. The degree of this vertex is 5. The maximum of d of v2 and d of v6 is 5. So we have here 5. If you construct like this matrix is called maximum degree matrix. The eigenvalues of this maximum degree matrix is called maximum degree eigenvalues of this graph. The sum of absolute values of eigenvalues of maximum degree matrix is called maximum degree energy of a graph. The eigenvalues of M of Z are like this. The eigenvalues of this matrix are like this. Sum of absolute values of these eigenvalues is 35.7684. This is called maximum degree energy. Adiga Chandrasekharan has given explicit expression for coefficients of characteristic equation of maximum degree matrix. He found maximum degree energy for some classes of graphs and given bounds for maximum degree energy, etc. I am mentioning some few results on in this paper. So the sum of the squares of maximum degree eigenvalues is equal to 2 times of summation I is equal to 1 to a plus ba into da square, where a and ba are defined like this. Then he established bounds for this maximum degree energy, and he found bounds for maximum degree eigenvalue. The maximum degree eigenvalues is always lies between minus of n minus 1 whole square to plus n minus 1 whole square. Recently, we developed this paper. We found interesting results. We have given better bounds than this result. We have given better bounds, sharper bounds, better bounds and sharper bounds than this result. Our result is now. I will give. This is not my topic. I will tell our results one by one. This is our result. If G is a graph of order n, then for any maximum degree eigenvalue of mu j, we have modulus of mu j is less than or equal to this value. For example, if you take a path graph, the eigenvalues are lies between minus of square root of 8 by n minus 1 to plus square root of 8 by n to n minus 1. Suppose n is equal to 8. Suppose if you take P8, the maximum degree eigenvalues lies between 8 gets cancelled minus 7 to plus 7. Whereas according to Adiga result, the eigenvalues are lies between minus 49 to plus 49. N is equal to 8 minus 1, 7 square, minus 49 to plus 49. So according to our result, the maximum degree eigenvalue of a path graph is lies between minus 7 to plus 1. In that case, our result is very sharper, and our result producing sharper bounds than existing result. Like that, we established some results. Then we concentrated on unicyclic graphs. We established this type of classes we have concentrated. We found bounds for maximum degree eigenvalues, and we calculated a general formula for maximum degree energy also. And we have given bounds for maximum different bounds. In this section, we have given different bounds for maximum degree energy, which are those are sharper than existing results. These are the results we established. This is another result. This is upper bounds. These are the upper bounds. These are different. These are the lower bounds. Next, we found general formulas for maximum degree energy for some classes of graphs. So we found that we find the general formula for maximum degree energy of a path graph, and similarly cycle graph, complete bipartite graph, crown graph, and edge we introduce. There is an important concept, that is edge deletion concept. We calculated energy of maximum degree energy of Kn minus C like this. We submitted these results to Arnold Journal of Mathematics for publication, which is a Sciendex journal. Next, then my topic. This is my topic. This is maximum degree Estrada index. Motivated with the above concepts, we introduced a new concept, that is maximum degree Estrada index. A maximum degree Estrada index is defined as ME of G is equal to summation I is equal to 1 to n e power mu I, where mu1, mu2, mu n are the maximum degree eigenvalues. In this paper, we established upper and lower bounds in terms of energy, and several graph parameters are obtained for maximum degree Estrada index. Maximum degree Estrada index is also calculated for some well-known classes of graphs. The maximum Estrada index of cycle and path graphs are obtained in terms of Bessel function, hyperbolic cost function. Exact and approximated values of maximum degree Estrada index of Pn and Cn are listed as a table. This is another formula, another form of Estrada index. So mk dash, we let mk dash is equal to summation I is equal to 1 to n mu ik. Suppose k is equal to 1. Suppose if we take k is equal to 1, mu1 dash is sum of the eigenvalues. Suppose k is equal to mu2 dash is equal to sum of the squares of eigenvalues. That is movements of eigenvalues. That is, we can simply call it the movements of eigenvalues. If you take summation of k is greater than or equal to 0, mk dash by k factorial, that is nothing but maximum degree Estrada index. Suppose if you take k is equal to 0, so summation I is equal to 1, that is 1 plus 1 plus up to so on. K is equal to 1, summation I is equal to 1 and mu I, that is mu1 plus mu2 plus mu I. Suppose k is equal to 2, summation I is equal to 1 to n mu I square. Like this it will come. Suppose if you take first term, 1 plus mu1 square by 2 up to so on, that is e power mu n. Suppose if you take second term, 1 plus mu2 dash square, mu2 square by 2 factorial up to so on, that is e power mu2 up to so on, e power mu. So we have given another formula for this maximum degree Estrada index. This is the definition of maximum degree Estrada index. We have given another formula like this. Next, in this section, we found we established bounds for the maximum degree Estrada index. So these are the two results we established in this section. This one is this one. Second one is this one. In the next section, we found upper bounds for maximum degree Estrada index. Upper bounds. We found we established different upper bounds for maximum degree Estrada index. This is one among them is this one. This is P, where P is the number of positive maximum degree eigenvalues. This is in terms of upper bound in terms of number of positive maximum degree eigenvalues. This is in terms of movements. In terms of movements, this upper bounds. This is another type. Next type, another type of relation. These are the different. We established different upper bounds. This is another upper bounds. This is another upper bounds. Next, this is very interesting topic. The next section is bounds for maximum degree Estrada index involving maximum degree energy. This is the maximum degree Estrada index is always less than or equal to e power EMG, where EMG is the maximum degree energy. Maximum degree energy. The maximum degree energy, the maximum degree energy, the maximum degree extraordinary index and maximum degree energy satisfies this inequality. Satisfies this inequality. This is the relation between maximum degree energy and maximum degree extraordinary index. This is the maximum degree extraordinary index and maximum degree energy is always less than or equal to n minus 1 into root m plus e power root m, where m is equal to this value. Next, in this section, we establish maximum degree extraordinary index. We found general formula for maximum degree extraordinary index for some classes of graphs. So Kn, complete graph. The maximum degree extraordinary index for Kn. That is general. We obtained a general formula for Kn. N minus 1 into e power minus of n minus 1 plus e power n minus 1 whole square. Here, this interesting point is we try to find out general formula for Cn, but we couldn't find the general formula. But we approximated. We found approximated value. Maximum degree extraordinary index of Cn is approximately equal to n into j naught of minus 4i, where j naught is a Bessel function. Similarly, maximum degree extraordinary index of Pn is approximately equal to n plus 1 to j naught of minus 4i cos h4. If we eliminate n from these two equations, we'll get a relation like this. It is just like a linear relation. Y is equal to mx plus c. If n is equal to 18, this value is equal to this value up to 8 decimal places. If n is equal to 20, we observed that this value is equal to this value up to 9 decimal places. If n is equal to 30, this value is equal to this value up to 11 decimal places. So for large values of n, we can take maximum extraordinary index of Pn is equal to maximum extraordinary index of Cn minus cos h4 plus j naught of 4n. So this is the, as n tends to, if n is very large value, it is almost satisfying a linear relation. It is a linear relation. So this is the table. This is the it is the exact and approximate values of MEE of Cn and MEE of Pn. This is the exact value of MEE Cn. This is the approximated value. That is our formula value. So as n tends to, n is large value, this MEE Cn is approaching to our approximated value, our formula value. Similarly, MEE Pn. We can observe that except for the first few values of n, the approximate values of the above equations give remarkable accurate values. Next we have taken KMN, complete bipartite graph. We obtained general formula for maximum degree extraordinary index. Similarly, star graph, crown graph also we obtained. These results we submitted to Springer SI. We hope this will be accepted for publications. We are waiting for the reviewers' comment. Now I will show that paper. I will show this paper. This is the paper on maximum degree extraordinary index. So he is my student, Kadrivel Sarvana is my student. Professor Ismail Nasi Jangul is my collaborator. He is from Turkey, the professor of mathematics at Volga University. This is the introduction about this concept. This is a maximum degree energy. This I explained briefly in the slides. Everything we cannot explain in the paper. So this is the definition of, we define like this. And this we have given another formula like this. They have given another formula like this. Maximum degree extraordinary index is equal to summation k is greater than or equal to 0, m dash k by k factor. Depending upon the problem, either we take this formula or this formula. Sometimes we use this formula to establish the result. Sometimes we take this result to establish the result. Sometimes we take this result to establish our required result. Next, bounds for maximum degree Stroud index. These are the bounds for maximum degree. We have given bounds, lower bounds and upper bounds for this maximum degree Stroud index. This is about lower bounds. These are the lower bounds. This is the proof for lower bounds. This is the proof for upper bounds. This is another. This is the. This is another bounds. Actually, these are sharper bounds than the previous result. Actually, this result you get a sharper bounds. This is the proof for this result. And the next section is upper bounds. We have given so many different upper bounds in terms of vertices, in terms of positive eigenvalues, in terms of generating from movements, in terms of movements, like this. These are different bounds we have given. Next, this is the result we have given. This is in this section we established bounds of maximum degree Stroud index in terms of energy of a graph. In terms of energy of a graph. These are the two theorems. Next one is in this section we established we derived maximum degree Stroud index of some classes of graphs. Kn complete graph. This is a complete graph. We established a general formula. Suppose if you take Cn, ME of Cn. We couldn't find a general formula, but we found approximated value for MECN. Here we established this is the maximum degree matrix for Cn. The eigenvalues of this matrix are 4 cos 2k pi by n. So it is not possible to give entire proof in the paper. So these are the eigenvalues of this graph, eigenvalues of this matrix. So if you apply some mathematical formulas, mathematical simplification, we have MECN is approximately equal to n into 4 times n into Bessel function of -4. Similarly, we found maximum degree Stroud index for Pn. This is about approximated value and original value. This is in this section, in this theorem, we have given in this theorem 24. In this theorem, we have given general formula for Kmn, complete bipartite graph. Complete by the maximum degree matrix for matrix of Kmn is like this: null matrix, a matrix A, transpose of A, block matrices. This is one matrix. This is one matrix. This is one matrix. This is one matrix. This is a block matrix of null matrix. This is null matrix. This A is this matrix. The spectrum of this graph, the eigenvalues of this matrix are like this. And if you apply simple mathematical calculations, we'll get maximum degree Stroud index is like this. Similarly, the star graph, we have this one. A crown graph, we have like this. We established, we found maximum degree Stroud index for a crown graph. These are the references for this paper. Okay, now I am going to my original slide. Now this is 14. These are the references of my presentation. So this is one of the very nice book on mathematical concepts in organic chemistry. Ivan Gutman and Pulaski. Next, so this is a very famous eminent mathematician R. Balakrishnan paper, The Energy of a Graph. It was published in Linear Algebra and its Applications in 2004. Next, the Gutmann first energy, this Gutmann paper. This is the first paper on energy of a graph. It was published in 1978, the energy of a graph. Then these are the references of my presentation. Now here, you see this one. This is a very, very interesting book, Stephen Wagner and Hang book. Wang, Introduction to Chemical Graph Theory. Introduction to Chemical Graph Theory. Next, Li-Shi Gutmann book. This is a very famous book. That is a textbook of graph energy. Textbook on graph energy. With this, I'm closing my presentation. Thank you. My special thanks to Professor Dr. Ratnakar Bala sir for inviting me to this conference and giving me an opportunity to deliver a talk. Thank you.
We have in our midst Dr. S. Minirani, Associate Professor, Department of Basics, Sciences and Humanities from NIMS Deemed University, Mumbai. She has done her PhD from NIT Calicut and she is a member in many mathematical societies, and to mention Ramanujam Mathematical Society, Indian Science Congress, American Mathematical Society, International Association for Engineers, Indian Society of Industrial and Applied Mathematics, Indian Mathematical Society, Association for Women in Mathematics, Mathematics Teachers Association, India. In the last 5 years, she has published 9 research articles besides 6 professional development activities. By now, she has received more than 5 honors and awards of international and national repute. She is also the course coordinator for discrete mathematics on SWAYAM. We are privileged to have you in our midst, madam. We welcome you to speak to our audience. Thank you, madam.
A very good morning to one and all. I am Dr. Minirani, working as an associate professor at the Department of Basic Sciences and Humanities at MPSTME NMIMS deemed to be University in Mumbai. It is indeed a pleasure to be a part of ICMAA 2020, the International Conference of Mathematical Advances and Applications. And I would like to thank the organizers, especially Dr. Ratnakar sir, for giving me a chance to be a part of this conference as a speaker. So today, I will be talking about fractal geometry, which is considered to be a very new branch of mathematics, which indeed started in 1980s. It's only having 30 to 40 years if we come down the history of mathematics. And also it is considered to be the geometry of nature. So this is my area of research, and this was my topic for research during my PhD course, which I've completed at NIT Calicut. During the midst of COVID, I hope all of you are safe at home or else at your workplace, wherever you are. Let me start with my topic. The topic for the day is, as I've told you, fractal geometry. Give me some time to share the screen. Okay, let me begin with my topic, fractal geometry, and it is considered to be the geometry of nature. It is my pleasure to share the knowledge that I've gained during my research period on the same topic. See, fractal geometry will make you see everything differently. There is a danger in actually understanding about it further, because you will risk the loss of your childhood vision of clouds, forests, galaxies, leaves, feathers, etc., uh, which you see besides you. See, your interpretation of these things is never going to be the same once you learn fractal geometry. The observation by Mandelbrot of the existence of geometry of nature has led to think in a new scientific way about the edges of the clouds and profiles of the top of the forests on the horizon. See, geometry is mainly concerned with the making of our spatial intuitions objective. So, classical geometry provides a first approximation to the structure of physical objects. That is, it is the language which we use to communicate the designs of technological products and very approximately the forms of natural creations. Fractal geometry is an extension of the classical geometry, and it can be used to make precise models of physical structures from ferns to galaxies. Okay, fractal geometry, I should say, it is indeed a new language. Once you speak it, you can describe the shape of a cloud as precisely as an architect can describe a house. Okay, so let us move ahead. As I do always, I would like to begin my talk with a wonderful quote by Albert Einstein. The most beautiful thing we can experience in the is the mysterious, and it is the source of all true art and science. So actually, man was always fond of um, unraveling the mysterious things around him, and that is what led to the development of science that has happened today. So we always feel like why the geometry is often whenever we describe geometry, why is it considered to be so cold and dry? So one reason lies in inability to describe the shape of a cloud, a mountain, or a coastline, or a tree. See, you know that clouds are not spheres, mountains are not cones, coastlines are not circles, and the bark is not smooth. Nor does the lightning travel in straight line. Let me quote. This is the line given by Benoit Mandelbrot, who is considered to be the father of fractal geometry. So we often see that the structures that we see around us, like clouds, mountains, or the coastlines, we try to approximate it with the classic using classical geometry. So clouds can be approximated using spheres or portions of spheres, or mountains using cones, and the coastlines using straight lines, or the bark of a tree using cylinders. And so whatever approximation we give to the natural objects that we find around us is only a is just a what do you say, first level approximation, I should say, because you know that whatever we see around us are not so smooth or are not so perfect shapes as we see in the case of the objects that we deal with in the classical geometry. And you know that the nature always exhibits a higher degree of complexity, and the number of distinct scales of length of patterns is for all the purposes is infinite. And the existence of these patterns actually challenges us to study the forms that Euclid leaves aside as being formless, to investigate the morphology of the amorphous. So these are the lines that I've taken from Benoit Mandelbrot, who is considered to be the father of fractal geometry. You will, some of you would be knowing about this topic. You would have read about the topic, or else you would be a person working in the topic. For a general person, if you try to understand what are fractals in one go, so it would be this is what you will get from the math world. Fractal is an object or quantity that displays self similarity in a somewhat technical sense on all scales. So it will be exhibiting self similarity property. We will come across the self similarity property of fractals and discuss it during the course of our presentation. The fractals need not exhibit exactly the same structure at all scales, but the same type of structures must appear on all scales, because you will see that when we look around and see many of the natural objects which are identified as fractals. Okay, this is a classical example of fractal, or else I should say rather an emblem for which we have chosen for a fractal, which is the Mandelbrot set, which was actually developed by Mandelbrot. And we will see the construction of this beautiful figure. So the beauty is that as you zoom in and again and again, so you actually zoom and move into it, you can see the same structure being repeated. This is what we were talking about, the self similarity structure. So the same pattern keeps on repeating whenever, as much as you zoom and try to go inside. So we will try to see how it has been constructed. You can see all those beautiful patterns coming again and again as we zoom in. So it's a never ending process actually. Okay, as I told you, this discipline of mathematics has developed only in the last 30 to 40 years. And a basic idea that we have here is of the geometry. So let us understand what geometry deals with. So basically, you know that when I talk about geometry, you have objects and then you have spaces. So the objects means uh, um, see, it can be points, it can be lines, spheres, rectangular parallelepipeds, or all those are objects that you deal with, and they live in spaces. So you know that a zero dimensional point lie in a one dimensional line, or a two dimensional plane, or a three dimensional plane. So when I talk about a one dimensional line, it can lie on a two dimensional plane or three dimensional space. So normally you have in geometry you have objects, and the objects lying in the spaces. So we can see that these objects can always live in the spaces of higher dimensions. So when I'm talking about the objects and spaces, you can always see that people were always studying about the regular objects. Regular objects means lines, sphere, triangles, rectangular parallelepipeds. All are those idealized objects that you have or that you deal with in the Euclidean geometry. So actually, if you see the objects around you, you can see these are actually the normalization, or sorry, idealization of the normal or the natural objects that you see around you. So actually, you can see that this is a sort of legacy that Pythagoras and Euclid has left behind. And see, they devised a concept of idealizing what we see in the actual nature. So that is how, as I've been telling you, the mountains were approximated with the cones, or the bark of the tree were approximated with the cylinder, etc. So this was a part of the Euclidean geometry. So when we are talking about spaces, then again we were talking about the flat surfaces. Okay, so either 2D space or a 3D space. So with whenever we talk or when we draw, it is all the flat surfaces that we were considering. So we had idealized objects and the idealized space, which were discussed and studied earlier. And by the end of 19th century, a revolution in mathematics, especially in geometry, happened with the work of Riemann, Gauss, and Lobachevsky. That they have started defining and studying the different types of surfaces other than the flat surfaces, I should say the curved surfaces. And it can be positively curved surfaces or negatively curved surface. And you can see Einstein has used it also in the theory of gravitation. And again, still we continued with using the idealized objects, or the perfect shapes, I should say, that the Euclidean geometry had offered to us. Uh, so whenever, in an easy way to understand what happens when you change the space, you can see that when I draw a triangle in the flat surface, the sum of the angles is 180. Whereas if I change it into a spherical surface, that means on a football, suppose if I draw it, you know that the sum of the angles is greater than 180 degree. So this is one simple way you can see. But still, these idealized objects remain. And see, as I was telling, it's after 1980, slowly that we started studying these objects which were curved or perforated or which had irregularities. That has been discussed and studied. Okay. So these type of irregular objectives and their properties are being studied under fractal geometry. So having laid this ground, we exactly now know the difference between so we now know the difference between the objects we have learned in school textbooks and also the objects that we actually see in nature. Again, the difference, if I should say, about the idealized object and the non-idealized object that you see in nature can be very well understood by simply saying that the non-idealized objects that you see in nature can be continuous but not differentiable anywhere. That means it is having continuously so many irregularities so that it becomes quite impossible for you to differentiate it. See, when I'm talking, simple way to explain it is using a curve. So suppose I have some curve y equal to fx in a two-dimensional plane, and you know that how the derivative is defined. So it's the slope of the tangent, and when I'm defining dy by dx as the limit of delta y by delta x as delta x tends to 0, you know that this derivative exists, or this limit exists only under the condition that when you make your delta x very small, you assume that your curve approximates to your delta y approximates to a straight line. So under that assumption only, you are able to define dy by dx. So in the case of the non-idealized objects that you you are going to see in nature, say for example, if engineers would understand, I can say that suppose we are recording the load on a power station, then you will get some kind of a graph which is continuously changing. So it would be a continuous curve. But if we zoom, see, at every fraction of a second, there will be some change in the load. And if the continuous graph is plotted, you will have so many irregularities, or else what do you say, I should say, ups and downs in the curve for a minute fraction of a second also. So as we zoom in also, you cannot make it to be a straight line. So whenever I cannot approximate it to a straight line, then there's no way that we can define differentiability there. So when I'm talking about non-idealized objects that is seen in nature, so it is having so much of irregularities on its surfaces, or else I can say that they are not smooth enough in the way we explain the differentiation as we are associated to the word smoothness. So the curves or the objects that you see in nature are not at all smooth enough for you to differentiate it, because even if you zoom or go very close and observe it, still you can see some irregularities as you go in. And so this is the major difference in a simple way. If I have to explain you the differences between an idealized objects which would be smooth, or else if I talk about a curve, you can say it is differentiable. Now let us talk a bit of the history. So it was not that this was not there in the history of mathematics. It was always there in the history. So you can see it is actually dated back in the 17th century, where Leibniz has actually what do you say, we're talking about was talking about the recursive cell similarity, but there also he had only considered straight lines to define that property, or else as an example he had chosen only the straight line. As I was saying, it was not that these properties or these curves were not there in the literature, but it was not being coined under the name fractals, or else it was not been able to be appreciated. Actually, it was being called as monster curves, because it was very difficult to be understood using equations. And also, since it was too abstract, and geometrically understanding was difficult, but only with the advent of the computers was it possible for the properly visualizing these and then appreciating this. So again, in 1872, you can see in Carl Weierstrass' paper the definition of a graph, which can be considered as fractal. This is what I was talking about. See, something like this: a graph or a curve which is having, see, continuously it is changing. So even if I zoom a small portion here, see at the tip, see, still you can see that it is not getting approximated to a straight line. So that means this was the curve which I was telling about. Just even if you plot the load on a power station, you will be getting something like this, which continuously changes. And also, von Koch in 1904 developed an accurate geometric definition repeatedly by trisetting a straight line. We will see how it is made. And this is now known as the Koch curve or Koch curve. Now, also in 1915, Sierpinski constructed the Sierpinski triangle. We will come across that example also, which is considered to be one of the, again, classical example of fractal. And in 1918, these all can be seen in the literature if we go through the history of mathematics. Fatau and Gaston Julia described the fractal behavior associated with the mapping of complex numbers, and this also led to the ideas about attractors and repellers, on eventually to the which led to the development of Julia set. Okay, this is the Mandelbrot set. This was the curve which I've shown you by zooming it. So as we go on zooming this, we can continuously come across the same structure, which is being told that it is being told that you can see all shapes that you can observe in nature once you go and zoom inside this picture. So you can see there's a something like a cardioid there, then there are circles, then all the what do you say, objects that is being seen in nature can be observed as we zoom in, and we can see that these patterns keeps on repeating. That is what was known as cell similarity. So Benoit Mandelbrot was the mathematician who had created this set, and he has studied the behavior of Julia set also. He was the mathematician who had coined the term fractal for these objects having certain properties. So this is him, Benoit Mandelbrot. Actually, see, to talk about his earlier childhood, he was not so studious studious kid while he was in school. Actually, he got interested in numbers through his uncle only, but he always felt that he was a misfit, because he understood that geometry his strength. Once he had a professor who asked the students to graph an equation, and he was very well able to visualize it. So he understood that he was having problem with the algebra part, but whereas in geometry he was very much able to visualize any equation that was given to him. So he understood what his gift was, and then actually later he was hired in IBM, and where new mathematicians and computer programmers were hired, and in 1958 actually. So he was actually given the task to find out why there was a static in the computer telephone lines. So then he graphed for 1 day, 1 hour, and 1 second. He realized that all the static always remained the same. So he called it the self similarity. He saw that pattern getting repeated. So this characteristic in which the smaller details of a shape have the same as the original form. See, in order to explain this, he has very well given this. I should say this. A picture wherein see, you have a hand and it keeps on the same pattern keeps on repeating. That is what he had observed while he was doing his task of observing the static of telephone lines, which he was doing at IBM. So he has very nicely explained it using a figure so that you can understand the same pattern keeps on repeating itself. Now, see, one of the important questions that has been considered in the history of fractal geometry is the question that was posed by Benoit Mandelbrot, and it was, how long is the coast of Britain? See, when I talk about this question, we always feel like there's no big deal about it. See, whatever scale we are going to use, you can just move around the coastline, and then you know that England is an island, and you can just move around the coastline and keep on measuring. Okay, so whichever scale you are starting with, any yardstick that you start with. See, when this is a rough way of explaining it. Suppose I'm considering my scale unit to be 200 kilometers. So you get the length. So you keep on measuring this. So suppose this is my scale of length 200 meters. You see that this is the only possible way that you can approximate it. Then you lose out so many detailing that is there actually present in the coastline. So then using this 200 kilometer, you get the length of this coastline to be 2,400 kilometers approximately. Then what you do is you see that so much of the detailings or the length has been missed out. So what you do is you try to reduce it. You try to reduce it to 50 kilometer, and you see that from 2,400 it increased to 3,400 kilometer. So you keep on doing this, because you see that here also you miss out some of the details. So as you do decrease the unit size, or else decrease the size of the scale or the yardstick that you're using for measurement of this island, you see that the length keeps on increasing. So what is the conclusion that you can make? So we end up seeing that as your length of the object that you're using for measuring the coastline tends to 0, your perimeter, or else the length of the coastline tends to infinity. So that is how mathematically we say. So we keep on decreasing the length of the scale or the yardstick that you use to measure the coastline, and you see that the length or the perimeter keeps on increasing. So as you near to 0, as mathematicians talk normally, so as your length tends to 0, the perimeter or the total length of the coastline tends to infinity. That is how you can say. But you can always see that even though the length of the perimeter tends to infinity, it encloses a finite area. So you know that the area of Britain remains the same. So this is another characteristic of fractal, which I should say, or I should say, which are being exhibited by natural surfaces, I should say, natural objects. This can be extended to, this is the case of one dimension. We are talking about length. This can be extended to surfaces also. See, if we are considering a natural surface, that is your lungs, okay? Its purpose, you know that it is to absorb as much oxygen as possible from the air. So as a result, for this requirement, it is that you should have maximum surface area exposed to air. Yet it must be having a finite volume, because it can be then accumulated inside our body within the rib cage. Okay, so here we come across the same property, infinite area. So we can see the maximum area. So as and when we go in the same way, we see that lungs can be considered as an object with infinite surface area enclosing a finite volume. So these are the objects or aspects which differentiate the natural geometric objects from the idealized objects that we were talking about. This we will never come to see in the idealized objects or the objects that we were learning in the textbooks, which is as a part of the Euclidean geometry. So there are different definitions that you can come across for fractals, and as I've told you, one single definition of fractal is not yet been finalized. But I can say, just like if I ask you to define a living object, it will be difficult for you to make it in one sentence. So instead, you can list down the properties of a living object. In the same way, I can list down the properties that will be exhibited by a fractal or by fractal objects. And not necessarily all the properties that we are going to study will be exhibited by all fractal objects. There will be some fractal objects which will be exhibiting certain properties. So one of the definitions, you can see that the Hausdorff dimension is greater than the topological dimension. So we will see how to calculate the fractal dimension that will be coming in the course of our discussion. Now, say this, I'll just show you how we are going to create that beautiful Mandelbrot set. Actually, he started with a recursive formula, x is equal to x squared plus 1. Sorry. See, you start with the formula x is equal to x squared plus 1 and iterate it a number of times. Since he was in IBM and he could possibly do it and visualize it using the computers, the graphing was easily possible. See, what you are going to do is you start with an initial value, you plug in value, and then you get the first set, and then you plug in this value, you continue this. So this is an iterative process, and then you try to graph it. So when he tried to graph the equation, this is what he got when he had considered this C as complex numbers. And whenever he tried, whenever we zoom it, as I was telling, you see that this is a self-similar object, and this kind of shape is an example for a fractal. And I told you this set or this was called as the Mandelbrot set. Okay. So actually, initially, as I was telling, before Mandelbrot had coined these words, people were calling it fractal monsters, because they iterated infinitely, and it was so difficult for them to graphically represent it. So what we exactly are doing is, you start with a function x square plus constant. You have an initial value x naught, then you get x naught square plus that constant, then you get an x1. So then you plug in x1 to the equation, you get an x2. So you keep on doing this, and this is how you see the orbit. So you start with x naught and see where it goes. Okay, let's start with seed 0. That means you are putting x naught is equal to 0 in this equation, and your c is taken as 1. So this is what you get. You know that it becomes bigger and bigger. That means it tends to infinity. Now, when I take c as 0 and your x naught as 0, this is what has happens, because you know that it's going to be a fixed point. So it remains at 0 only, even if you change the values infinitely. Now, suppose I change my c to -1 and start with 0. So this is how it goes. It's a 2 cycle. So it just repeats between -1 and +1 and 0. So it oscillates actually. So if I just change -1 to -1.1, you see what is happening. Now you need a calculator to compute these values, because it goes on increasing the decimal values. See, for some, what was the observation? The observation was, for some real values of c, the orbit goes to infinity, orbit of 0 goes to infinity, but for other values, the orbit of 0 does not escape. So now suppose we are doing the same with the complex numbers or complex values. We are going to iterate complex values, okay? So both z and c here are complex numbers. So let's have z square plus I. Let's start with 0. So this is what happens. So it just oscillates. It's a 2 cycle again. So you have I and -1 plus I only. So this is how it happens. So it just oscillates between these two. So now suppose I change my seed to 2i and start with seed 0. So this is what you get. It goes to infinity because from 0 it goes to 2i, then minus 4 plus 2i, and then becomes bigger and bigger. So it escapes to infinity, I should say. So the same observation, sometimes the orbit of 0 goes to infinity, other times it does not, even for complex iteration. So how did we construct the Mandelbrot set? See here, all the C values for which the orbit of 0 does not go to infinity was considered. And actually, why are we considering or giving so much importance to the orbit of 0? It is because it's a critical point of z square plus c. And now suppose this is how we have an algorithm for computing the Mandelbrot set. Start with the grid of complex numbers. You know, complex numbers requires a two-dimensional plane wherein x-axis is identified with real axis and y-axis is identified with imaginary axis. You start with the grid of complex numbers. So each grid point, you know, it is a c value. So complete the you compute the orbit of 0 for each c. Okay, if the orbit of 0 escapes, color that grid point. So red gives you the fastest escape. Orange means it's still slower escape. Then yellow, green, blue, violet is it's in the order in which the escape. So it becomes slower and slower. And compute the orbit of 0 for each c. And if the orbit of 0 does not escape, leave that grid point as black. So this is how what you end up with. So this is the figure that you get, and this is called the Mandelbrot set M, which is been mentioned here. So this was what I was saying. So the fractal is a mathematical set that has fractal dimension. This is one of the definition that you can see in literature. So we need to understand what a fractal dimension is. Again, understanding dimension, when I'm talking about dimension, there is a dimension of the embedding space and also the dimension of the objects, because we are talking about geometry. So you have the underlying space and the objects in the space. So when I'm talking about dimension, you need to know the dimension of both. Again, see, dimension of embedding space is always talked about using the degrees of freedom. See, when I'm saying about degrees of freedom, you know that by intuition, see, whenever I'm talking about dimension, in most of the cases, even though it was not very well done in schools, except you go for a specialized mathematics course wherein you deal with dimensions of spaces using in some parts of the mathematics. But apart from that, if you consider the school days, most of the cases the dimension was intuitively understood by us. When I say a 0 dimension, a point, or a straight line 1 dimension, or also 2-dimensional space, the 3-dimensional objects, say it intuitively we understood that a point is a 0-dimensional or a curve is 1-dimensional, etc. So actually, when I'm talking about the dimension of the embedding space and also the dimension of the object, I told you the dimension of the embedding space is always explained using the degrees of freedom to move in that space. If you say that you have a 1-dimensional space that is a straight line, it means that you have the freedom to move left or right, okay, in that direction only. But when I come to 2-dimensional space, you know that you have the freedom to move left, right, and also front and back. And when you come to 3-dimensional objects, you have one more degree. Either you can move up and down also. Apart from left and right and front and back, you have the one more direction to be free to move across. So then it comes to dimension 3. So that is how we have defined the dimension of the embedding space. But when you talk about the dimension of the objects, it is actually roughly, if we can say the dimension of object, it is the value which says how much it fills this space. So so when I'm talking about the natural objects or the fractal objects, you can see that the fractal objects have non-integral dimensions. Non-integral dimensions means the dimensions which are not integers. See, when I'm talking about the dimension of the embedding space, you see that since we have defined it using the degrees of freedom, and since we have defined it so it can only be integers. so your dimension of the embedding space happens to be only integers, whereas when I'm talking about the dimension of the objects, it actually is the notion of how much it fills the space where it lives. So it can be considered to be having non-integer value as dimensions. I know those who are not familiar with this fractal geometry would find it a bit difficult to accept it, because this would have been the same difficulty when people would have faced once they have shifted from natural numbers, which was introduced for counting, to the fractions, because numbers were only introduced for counting, and then half or one fourth doesn't make any sense when it is used practically only for counting of the objects. So now let us see what is the actual concept of dimension of an object. So when I'm having an object living in the two-dimensional space, how much does it fill the two-dimensional space? That has been measured, or that is being understood by saying the dimension of objects. So actually, in order to measure this dimension, the fractal dimension, or else you can call it as box dimension, we can see whenever you have an object, you can cover it with the number of grids or else squares or boxes, and count the number of boxes required to so as I was saying, so in order to understand or understand the dimension of objects or how much it fills the space, the easiest way is you cover the space using boxes of certain size, and you just count the number of squares in which your object is being placed. And as you decrease the length of the side of these boxes, you can see that the number of squares, the count of the number of squares which fill the object keeps on increasing. So if suppose the length of the side of the box is some epsilon, and then capital N is the number of boxes that cover your object that you want to measure the dimension of, you can see that we get a relation of this epsilon and this N. See, we get this we get a relation n epsilon as a constant divided by epsilon raised to the degrees of freedom. Epsilon raised to degrees of freedom means degrees of freedom is the dimension of your embedding space. So when epsilon tends to 0, that means the size of the boxes tend to 0, you can see that in order to find this, you know that this is the dimension term coming. In order to retrieve this dimension, what we have to do is you have to take logarithm on both sides and get df, and you can see that df can be written as logarithm of n epsilon by logarithm of 1 by epsilon as epsilon tends to 0. This is defined as the fractal dimension or the box dimension of a given set. And as I've told you, this is exactly telling you how much does your object fills the embedding space. So it is often seen that most of the fractal objects that you see will be having the value of the dimension coming to be a non-integral value. That means value in between your integers. See, for example, for it is a line section, you know that these are all perfect figures. You know that the dimension is 1, 2, and 3 if it goes to square, and then for a cube. These are the Euclidean objects or the regular objects, or else the idealized objects that we were talking about. Since I told you to get the formula of dimension, what we have done is your formula of k by epsilon square in the case of a two-dimensional object. You can take the logarithm on both sides to retrieve that 2, because you know that 2 is the dimension value. So in the same way, I can generalize it for the calculation of dimension of an object, which is ln of n epsilon by ln of 1 by epsilon. So this is another classical example of a fractal. And actually, if we try to calculate the box dimension or the fractal dimension of this Cantor set, we see that you know how the Cantor set is being constructed. So if I take my box size as 1 by 3, you can see there are 2 units. Then you keep on reducing epsilon. Then you can see that the number of boxes required to cover your object, the Cantor set, goes on increasing as 2 raised to k. And in order to get that, in the same way, we use the formula d is equal to ln n epsilon by ln by ln 1 by epsilon. So you get it as ln 2 by ln 3, that is nothing but approximately 0.6309. So you can see that the Cantor set is actually one of the classical examples of a fractals which is having a dimension 0.6309. So logically also you can see that this can be accepted, because it is neither a straight line wherein your dimension is 1, or neither it is a single point where the dimension is 0. So it has to be some value between 0 and 1, which is actually calculated as 0.6309. So this is again in the basis of cell similarity property of fractal. So you know that fractal can be considered as a rough or fragmented geometrical shape that can be split into parts, each of which will be approximately the reduced size copy of the whole. And this property is called as self similarity. So when I talk about cell similarity, there can be different types of cell similarity. It can be exact cell similarity, approximate cell similarity, or statistical self similarity. So this is exact self similarity, wherein you can see the exact picture of the whole, or else the shape of the whole coming again and again in your pattern. Whereas these are all mathematically constructed fractals, which you can see that exact self similarity from the geometrical shape. From here, it is being constructed. Now, approximate cell similarity means this is the most common type of cell similarity that you observe in your natural objects. See, approximately you can see the same pattern coming repeatedly again and again. So statistically, statistical cell similarity, an example is see, average. The irregularity is the same on the average. So an example is the coastline of any country. So in the real world, you can see these self similarities. You can see in the fern, this structure keeps on repeating. So here also. So this is your broccoli. This was the lungs that I was talking about. If you see, the surface area tends to infinity. This is a constructed tree. Actually, in this tree, you can see this one branch keeps on repeating at different points to give that tree. So this is the Sierpinski triangle, which I was talking about, which was constructed by Sierpinski. So he started with an equilateral triangle. So he joined the midpoints and removed the triangle that he has got by joining these midpoints, and then he iterated this again. You are left with 3 triangles again. So in these 3 triangles also you do the same. You mark the midpoints and then join, you get equilateral triangle, you remove that, and then you keep on iterating it. This is what you end up with. After iteration 5, you keep on doing it, and whatever you get as an end product is called the Sierpinski triangle. So in the same way, if I calculate the dimension, you can see that this is not the entire or the full triangle where the dimension can be 2, and it is not exactly a straight line for which the dimension is 1. So it is actually giving you a value of 1.58 if I go in the same way of calculating a fractal dimension. So see, logically also it you are able to understand it, because I've told you the dimension of an object is always the number that specifies how much it fills the space in which it lives. Now, coming to the mathematical way of defining a fractal or constructing a fractal. It has been done using iterated function systems or IFS. So for that, you need to have a fixed space, let us say Euclidean space Rn, and you denote H of Rn as the set of non-empty compact subsets of Rn, and you define a metric on this space H of Rn, and then you prove that H of Rn is complete under this metric, and this metric is called the Hausdorff metric, which is defined as the maximum of the distance of set AB and distance of set BA. That is, if I actually go to the definition, it becomes maximum of supremum over x element of A, distance of xb, and supremum over y element of B, distance. So this is exactly your d of AB, and this is your d of BA. Okay, so H of AB is defined as the maximum of that. You know that that is a metric, and also we can prove that H of Rn is complete under this metric. So now you define hyperbolic IFS or iterated function system on this complete metric space. So okay, it consists of a complete metric space and also a finite set of contraction mappings on X. So you start with a space and you have a metric defined on it. So you then define a finite set of contractions on it, and the notation of IFS is given by set X comma Wj, if Wj's are the contraction mapping. And each of the contraction mapping will be having the contractivity factor Sj and your S. For this IFS, you define the contraction factor as the maximum of all these contractivity factors for individual contraction mappings that you define on the set X. And you know what is a contraction. So whenever S is a function on a space which is a contraction, you know that the distance between Sx and Sy is less than or equal to C times distance between X and Y. So, and you know that any contraction mapping is continuous. Okay. Now, so we started with a space and a set of contractions defined on it, which is an IFS. And then using this IFS, we are going to define a transformation W on your Hx. The space Hx is nothing but the set of all non-empty compact subsets of X. And you define that as W of B is equal to union of Wjb from j equal to 1 to n for all B in Hx. And then you can prove that this is also a contraction mapping, and it is having the contraction factor as S, the same as your IFS. And when I say it is having contraction factor S, it means that H of this WB, WC should be less than or equal to S times H of BC for any BC you consider in Hx. Okay. So you know that a contraction mapping in a complete metric space has a unique fixed point, and this unique fixed point is defined as the attractor or else the fractal. Okay, this fixed point described in the theorem is called the attractor of the IFS, which is a fractal. So this is how you construct actually fractal. So as I've told you, Cantor set was an example for a fractal. So in order to define or construct this fractal set, you start with the unit interval 0, 1, that is your space, and your normal metric, Euclidean metric would do. So now you have actually, when you see this Cantor set, you can see that it is the union of two copies of itself. So it is the so whatever you see on the left hand side is same as that you see on the right hand side. So you need two set of contraction mappings to define it. So my first function is x by 3 and second function is x by 3 plus 2 by 3. So I start with 0 and 1. You know that it goes to 0, 1 by 3 and 2 by 3, 1. So this will be reduced to this part by the first function, and this will be reduced to this part by the second function. You keep on applying this again on this. This becomes this, and this becomes this. So it keeps on repeating, and finally you end up with your Cantor set. In the same way, in order to construct the Sierpinski triangle, I need, you know that Sierpinski triangle can be considered as the 3 copies of itself, because whatever you see here, this is the copy of all that. So 3 copies of itself you see. So we need 3 functions to define. This is how. So this has to be taken to this triangle, and this triangle. So we need 3 contraction mappings. So we continuously use this, apply iterations, and then whatever comes as the fixed point, or else if you keep on iterating, whatever comes as your end product is the attractor, or which is a fractal objects. Now coming to the application part, say the fractal geometrical application or fractals you can see in mainly the graphics, designing problems, or in the designs, computer design, graphical designs that has been created in many of the movies. You can see all those effects, and mainly in image compression. And the fractal antennas is one of the important application of fractal. Whatever antennas that you will be using in your mobile phones. So earlier, the size of the antennas used to be very big to capture all the frequencies, whereas now, since the mobile size is becoming smaller, obviously your size of the antennas also should reduce so that it fits into the smaller device, but to capture the maximum radiation possible. So that is made possible using fractal antennas. And in economy and statistics also, the application of chaos theory has been applied, and definitely in climate studies. So these are all the areas where you can find the applications. So before I end, I would just like to share with you a video. Some of you would have seen it, but I would just quickly take you from the micro to the macro. So we start from the earth and we try to move quickly to the outer space. So see, the kilometers is mentioned here. So we've reached 100,000 kilometers, then 1 million kilometers. So we started seeing the asteroids, then inner planets, the outer planets, the Kuiper belt, then the dwarf planets also, because we are 100 billion kilometers above. So we have started seeing inner Oort cloud. We have reached 1 light year. See, the neighboring stars also is visible to us. So now it's 100 light years. See, 100,000 light years. So we started seeing the Milky Way also, the neighborhood galaxies also. So we started seeing the local supercluster, then cosmic web. 1 billion light years, 10 billion light years. That's all. The uniform universe after that. So let us quickly come back to the Earth from where we have started. We have reached back. So now let us go to the micro level. Now we are in micrometers. We have gone to nanometers now. Now picometers. We have started seeing atoms, then inner electrons. And femtometers, we have started seeing the nucleus, the protons and neutrons, the quarks. So that's all that I had to share about fractal geometry. There's a lot more to it, but since the time is restricted and it was only to give an introduction to the topic of fractal geometry. It's an emerging field wherein a lot of researches are happening. I would like to end this presentation of mine with a wonderful quote again. The more you realize the smallness of your existence, the larger will become your presence. So you'll try to make your presence felt in this universe as you realize that how much small is your existence. So that is what I tried to do, just by using that video, quickly taking to you to the outer space, to the inner, what do you say, from the micro to the macro, I should say. So let me end my presentation. These are some of the references. And this is one considered to be one of the basic textbooks which explains very clearly the constructions of fractals. So let me end my presentation here. Thank you very much, audience, for being wonderful and giving your time for listening to the talk and trying to understand the subject. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of ICMAA 2020, which is to be held during August 7th and 8th. And I feel so much privileged to be a part of this. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, madam. Thank you, sir, for your informative talks this morning. Once again, on behalf of the conference and the delegates, we thank you. Now we shall proceed for the interaction session. Delegates are requested to just click the tab or the button that is given below this window, discussion live in Zoom. As you click it, you will be taken to the Zoom. There we'll have some 15 to 20 minutes interaction exclusively with the speakers. If anyone wants to clarify or add something, may do so discussing with the speakers of this morning. Later, we shall proceed for the paper presentation sessions. We have two parallel sessions today, and yesterday we had two parallel sessions, track 1 and track 2. Today we call them as track 3 and track 4. And as per the timetable served, those scheduled on track 3 will be presenting in the conference room number 1, and those who are scheduled in track 4 will be presenting in conference room number 2. And to enter into those rooms, you have to simply just click conference room 1, those who are scheduled there, that is track 3 delegates, and those who are scheduled in track 4 has to click conference room 2. And of course, we'll also give you some information on WhatsApp group so that you enter very easily. And this is for now, and we'll update you things on the Zoom and also in the further sessions. And with your cooperation, let's have a wonderful session. Thank you very much.